Hi, pleasure to be
Hi,
here.
Anthony.
So I'm Steve Fox, and I'll jump in for the first part, and Keith will chime in with comments, and he's got a section coming up in a bit. So, pleasure to be here today. It's an interesting topic to go through. I like to start off with, I call it, remember the good old days. You know, things have changed so much over the past few years, and I'm kind of being facetious, of course, but, you know, a lot of us have been around. We remember some of the early, like, scalable sites where really the main thing you were worried about was just did you have enough capacity to serve the site. And so much has changed over the years, you know. And of course, I'm being a little facetious here. We had different kinds of problems in those days, but things have changed a lot. But monitoring and keeping the site up, you know, 10 years ago is a different beast than it is today. So that's kind of the point I'm talking about here. I mean, one or two browser types made up 90% of the traffic many years ago. And really, the main thing you had to do at that point was just to monitor the utilization of your web and app tiers in the database. As long as you had enough compute power, you were doing pretty good. And you run a handful of synthetics against the site for availability and response time, and you really did a pretty good job. You had other things to worry about, of course, but monitoring was different. So I want to contrast that to kind of where the world has evolved and all the complexities that are now introduced that bring this to make it a different beast. I mean, we still have, you know, our three tiers that were, you know, the web, the app, and the database tier. We have a lot of that, of course, but so much more is complicated by the fact that now much of the content is being delivered not from origin, not even from our control. We have CDNs that are caching this out at the edge. We have a lot of third-party content that comes together, and much of the presentation is actually being calculated now on the client, whether it's AJAX mobile or whatever. So it's a far different beast than what we had before. And in fact, I did a little test. There's some, you know, great tools like Chrome Developer Tools or Tamper Data. You can go out and take a look at just some of these sites and see the complexity of what's loading. So I went to Amazon.com, just hit the home page, and there was 250 separate HTTP requests in order to load just the home page. And they were being served over some 24 domains and at least 10 partners. So all of that's happening just to do a simple home page load, and any one of those can cause performance problems. So, you know, how do you get a handle around that is a real challenge. And even your own domain can be distributed. So not only is a small percentage of traffic coming to you that you control, often you're spreading this out across multiple data centers. It might be your own, it might be a private cloud, it might be public cloud, or a mixture thereof. So it introduces even more complexity into when things go wrong, what could be happening. So Track did a research study. This is kind of interesting. And they came back with the result that 71% of organizations were reporting that third-party content was creating a significant challenge for them in managing web performance, because it was out of their control and it's also hard to measure, which is right in line with what we were just discussing. So the question then becomes, how do we monitor in this more complex distributed world? Well, I'm going to throw the first tip up for you, which from my point of view, one of the first things you have to do is we've got to consider the client as a new tier. We're used to watching the web tier, the app tier, and the database tier. Really, the client is a new tier. We need to consider it as such. And the reason for that is it's really the only point of consolidation now of the user experience. With it talking to so many different domains, simultaneous, pulling all that together, it's really the only point that we can accurately measure what the end user is actually seeing. So then the point comes up is, well, is this really new? Well, no, it's not. We've talked about the client as a tier, and we've had that as a perspective for many years, but if you look at it from the point of view of monitoring, I think it's a bit of a shift for some. And then I like to go back just a bit through the history, which I think is kind of interesting. If we look at the shift that's happened in processing and network power, it's interesting. The early days of the mainframe, everything was on the mainframe. They were literally called dumb terminals, and even the presentation was calculated on the mainframe. The challenge, of course, was it just didn't scale well. Worked okay with a handful of users, but when you started loading it up with hundreds or thousands, it couldn't keep up. So as the PC hit the market, the whole big thing in the 80s was the client server. And yes, I'm dating myself. I remember this. But with client server and the PCs, you could move the presentation layer off of the mainframe, and as you scaled out users, you scaled out processing capability. So it was a big jump, lots of distributed systems at that point. But then the challenge came is you have to keep the client up to date. It was a maintenance nightmare. How do you roll out a new version, how do you get it on all those different PCs? So really the web came about to solve that problem. It's the ubiquitous client. The client became the browser. And then the server, and as long as you met with the HTTP protocol, you could do anything. And I'd say by most accounts, the web was a successful technology architecture. It's kind of fueled several economic revolutions, so I would say it would be successful. But even it had challenges, right? So as you start to standardize on a particular browser, and all the presentation was being done from the server, you lost a little bit from the user experience. And that's really what the second or third wave, whatever you want to call it, Web 2.0, Web 3.0, what cloud is all about. Is like, let's get the user experience back together. And that means more processing on the client. It means validation right there. It means not having to wait to talk to the server in order to respond to the user. It's very interactive. So it's great for the user, but it introduces some challenges as far as monitoring. So how do we effectively monitor this new tier? Well, number one is you got to get monitoring code running on the tier. There's no other way around it. It's the only place that you can pull it together. There is I call it the myth of agentless monitoring, but you really have to have some sort of code running there, whether it's standard code or code that you put in through your application. You've got to get a grip on what's happening there if you really want to understand what's happening for your users. So there is a little bit of help for you in the browser, and it's getting better. One of the things that's come out is the navigation timing API, part of HTML5 spec. It's been picked up by the majority of modern browsers, with the exception of Safari. And what this enables you to do is the browser records how long it took to load a page. And it'll keep track of things like DNS requests, how long it took to resolve that into an IP address, initiating the timing. There's some dozen metrics or so that are quite useful. And then where it does fall short, though, is it's the entire page load. You might, in the case of Amazon, we loaded 250 elements. It'll give you the entire time to load the whole thing, but if one of those elements took 5 or 10 seconds, you won't know which one. So the new spec is called resource timing, which is it's under development, hasn't finalized, but it's pretty well stable. And in fact, it's been picked up and it's currently implemented in its current state by 2 browsers, IE10 and Chrome both support it. And this gives you the granularity down to the individual resource elements. So the individual JPEGs, the individual style sheets, you can see if there's a slowdown, which piece of that page load was causing it. So that'll be a big step forward. And you get this, again, from the browser. So not a whole lot of extra work you have to do in order to get that data. But if you're running an AJAX application, you still have to get JavaScript in the browser. Even in the case of the navigation timing or the resource timing API, that data is available in the browser, but you have to have JavaScript there to actually query it and report it back so you collect it somewhere. So you have to get some sort of monitoring code running. And in the case of mobile, it's analogous, but now we're talking, binary code. So you actually have to link in some monitoring code inside your app if you're going to get this type of information. So at this point, I have a couple of audience poll questions I just wanted to do so we could get a feel for where the different audience members are and a couple of different deployment technologies. Let me try to launch these. So if you could read through that and give us an answer, and we'll publish the results here in a little bit. And in the meantime, I'll invite Keith to jump in with any comments, and I'll hand over to him to talk about the specifics of cloud and distributed cloud and how that can affect both your application and how you monitor it.
Thanks, Steve. So in the meantime, while we're waiting on the poll questions to be answered, I actually do have an interesting question for you, which is with the advent of the presentation layer of these information applications, whether it's mobile or web browser-based, being pushed out to the edge, what are you seeing as the uptake on developers being able, as of right now, taking advantage of the opportunities to be able to see more visibility into their application from the user side? How strong is the uptake? Because I'm a systems engineer, so I don't see things as much from the user side as I would like to a lot of times.
As far as pushing content to the edge, or by content to the edge, do you mean to the devices themselves?
Well, so I mean, going back through your history, when a while back, monitoring was basically just with log analysis. So a user would hit the server, the web application server would log the request, and then you could pull those back together and get some idea of what your users are doing. So now, with the advent of everything coming from a million different places, what is you're saying with the uptake of what are you seeing with the uptake from developers being able to take advantage of that?
Oh, I see. Yeah. So I think it's exploding. I mean, it's like any technology; it's different adoption rates, but just in terms of, things like analytics, I mean, the majority of sites have something like Google Analytics on them these days, which is tracking as you go through, which is actually happening from the client as they go out. The same thing is happening with mobile applications. It's actually surprising the chattiness that a lot of these mobile applications, if you look at them, they're reporting back. They're recording usage. In fact, there was some stories where some apps were actually like detecting when a new version of iOS was about to be released from Apple, because they were seeing new versions come from inside of Apple with a different iOS registration on them. And so the amount of visibility that you get is going up dramatically, and the ability to see not only when they're using it, but also what part of the application they're using, so that you can get dynamic feedback without having to go out and poll your users, is jumping up quite a bit. So we're getting more and more visibility, and the cutting-edge developers are taking advantage of that capability.
Very, very cool. So it's about time to start moving into the next step of things. So let's
push the second poll questions before you jump.
Sounds good. That sounds great. Let's do that.
It's a similar one to the first one, but it's basically the same set of questions. One's for AJAX and one's for mobile.
Fantastic.
So go ahead and jump in.
All right, cool. So while everybody's answering, I'll go ahead and start my side of things from my perspective. Again, I'm a system engineer. So my focus in this particular presentation is application architectures, specifically application architectures on infrastructure cloud-based hosting services, and the challenges that these types of architectures can throw into monitoring and getting a good idea of health for your application. So it's not specifically AJAX focused, but I will point out the different places where AJAX level monitoring and being able to put information in the end user and the browser side of things will be able to help you get a better idea of the health of your application stack, and not only the health of your application stack, which is kind of the traditional focus, at least from the system administrator perspective, but also the user uptake of being able to use features of your application and and generating heat maps where people are actually really focusing on in your application. So this does lend to some of the mobile stuff as well. As far from my perspective, from a system engineer, mobile client's just a different client of the same stack. It's all going to be serving everything up via HTTP into your mobile client anyway. So, so that's kind of my perspective on things and where we're going to go with this. So before we dive deep into that, to give everybody a little bit more time for the poll questions, Steve, do you have any questions from my side of things before we move over?
No, I just think it would be interesting to expand upon not only the complexity of CDNs and third party, but on the origin of the content that companies are presenting themselves, the complexity that cloud and hybrid cloud brings to trying to keep these things operational and performing for their end users.
Yeah, it can definitely be a challenge, especially as the size of your data continues to expand. One of the interesting things that you have to start figuring out is when your data gets bigger than a single database system can handle, you have to start sharding it. And then when you start sharding your data, you have to be very intelligent about where those shards live, so that your application performance is still reasonably fresh across a globally distributed, hopefully, a globally distributed application and audience. So let's dive into that. We've got everybody should have had plenty of time to answer these polls. So let's start moving into talking about this. So what we have now, what we got up right now is a really, really basic diagram of kind of a simple application architecture. It's not that simple, but it's simplified from where a lot of cloud applications, or at least large cloud applications, are going. So what we're looking at is the same application stack that Steve was talking about earlier, only distributed across multiple regions in a single cloud. So with a single cloud, we're talking about something like Rackspace or Amazon or any of the big public clouds. Could also be in a local cloud behind your firewall, managed by your IT department, or it could even be two physical infrastructures just to get some geographic distribution. All of this applies to all of that. So what you've got is your basic application stack with your 3-tier web app database with a little bit of replication knowledge going back and forth between them. So what you need to do in a situation like this is be able to maintain data transfer between both of these regions. You want to make sure that if any one region fails, that you have as up-to-date data between regions as you possibly can, but you also want to have the information that people are retrieving on the local region, especially if you're doing any kind of geolocation-based load balancing. You want to focus on having that kind of information as close to the endpoint as you possibly can. So being able to monitor like cache hits and cache misses in your distribution is really, really important. So one of the ways you can do that is by using the AJAX-based monitoring. You can just keep an eye on the pieces of data that you're having to load from cache. Wrap a monitor around that call. Wrap a timer around that call. So if you know that a cache hit takes a certain amount of time, a cache miss is definitely going to take a lot longer. So you can keep an idea of which region is handling cache hits and misses a lot better. And from that, you can give a lot more insight into how you're managing things. So another interesting thing when you're starting to distribute stuff like this that you run into is that as you're starting to aggregate information from multiple locations, so not just within your own application stack, so the region 1 and the region 2, but when you're pulling in both cached cache data points in your CDN and information from your third-party applications, all of these have to pile together to be able to get a good idea of what's going on in your browser. So you have to be able to monitor these individual elements. So the main point about this is that these distributed architectures add a lot of complexity. They throw in a lot of monkey wrenches in not just performance, but even insight into what your users are doing. And the interesting thing with this complexity is it does introduce a lot of unexpected errors. The more things that you're pulling together in a browser, the more ways things can go wrong. So having a good visibility from the top of the stack at the browser level all the way down to the bottom of the stack with just I/O times with writes to your database on disk. These kind of things can give you a really good insight as to the health of your application, and it can also improve your user experience overall, because all of us get really frustrated when you click on something and it takes more than a second or two for your page to load. So moving on, let's dig a little bit deeper into one of those region architectures so that we can talk about some of the issues that I was talking about. So the same diagram that we were looking at, this is just a zoomed in view of a single region. So instead of just your standard 3-tier, I've kind of rolled the web and the application servers into one tier here. You've also got your cache systems. And so with caching, you're going to have, this is essentially, if for the developers and sysadmins in the audience, this is like your Memcache or your Apache Cassandra, these kind of things that are storing snippets of data, not total pages or total presentations at the content delivery layer. That's a second layer of caching that you have to pay attention to. So when you're dealing with that, you also have to handle data replication, and there actually should be one extra arrow from not only from your databases between regions, but depending on the caching system, you may also be replicating data at the cache layer between your regions. So one of the things that you want to pay attention to is how fresh your cache is, and there's two views on that. The first, as far as two views into that knowledge, the first view is looking directly at your cache system. So you can actually check within your cache system both hits and misses because your caching systems, pretty much every one of them will track that information, and you can filter that up through your monitoring system, whether it's log-based or actual activity-based. Activity-based, you'd want to roll that directly into your software, into your application code. But either way, you get visibility into that. The second way is just from the user experience. From the user browser-based monitoring, again, you can watch your cache hits and misses. If you're pulling in specific pieces of data, you can also watch the timing of that, and from that you can infer whether your caching's replicated or not. And the same thing with your database. So things that are pulling directly from the database that aren't necessarily going into the cache. So they have things like authentication, user management, and the things that you don't typically store in your cache layer. Those you also want to keep a visibility on. So when these things start breaking, you can have problems, and so by monitoring and trending that, you can be a little bit more up into you get more insight into what's happening, so that you can be proactive instead of reactive. So the point to be made there is that these clouds are unreliable. You've got I/O problems on individual virtual machines. You've got noisy neighbor issues. If your VM is co-located or co-resident with somebody else who's doing a lot of heavy data processing that's very disk intensive, I/O and writes to disk on your database can cause problems. Your individual systems can disappear at any time, so you have to architect for failure. But by monitoring your applications, you can get early insight into things like these noisy neighbor problems. Do I need to spin up a second database node so that I can handle these issues? Those are the kind of things that watching the monitoring on these complex infrastructures can handle. So finally, the last bit of stuff for this is a user interaction UI/UX monitoring. You can get insight into what your users are really doing. And Steve was talking a bit about this before. with being able to, with a lot of the browser plugins and browser APIs, you can pull some information, but also with clever interaction with your monitoring systems and custom AJAX, you can get a really, really good insight into exactly what your users are doing, much better than you can with like standard JavaScript tracking stuff like Google tracking. So tracking actions directly within your JavaScript and sending that information into either your monitoring system or into your application database that you can pull back reporting helps improve your UI heat map in a massive way, so that you can have very, very, very direct insight driven by your developers. And this is the key point. Your developers can actually architect their applications to do this, so that your applications give you insight into their own health and also into your user actions and usability, so that you can improve your application's functionality within your application itself. And these analytics, by doing those techniques, will greatly improve your user experience by giving you a lot more information about what your users really are doing. In some ways, it can even improve over blind user tests when you put a user right in front of an application and watch them. So that's my side of things. We can pass it back to Steve.
Question or comment for
yes.
you on that topic, actually, which is kind of related, which is
please do.
You're talking about the actual end users and what they're doing and the value of that data. And I was wondering if you could comment just a little bit about the comparison of that versus synthetics, especially from a performance point of view, and how the fact a lot of times synthetics get an artificially boost high because the caching tends to work better for them in most cases.
That's very true. So the main point is that by building good insight into your application, by having your application record activity, it gives you a much more accurate level of insight into what's happening into what your users are doing, and that filters from the bottom all the way up to the top of your application stack. So if user requests for particular functions are particularly slow, then your users are going to try to move over to a different part of your application to get the same thing done if you've made that possible. And so you can watch that happening. If likewise with aggregate collection like Google Analytics, what those give you is insight basically from a URL level. It's really hard to get good UI UX tracking if your application is very heavily AJAX focused, because you're loading micro pieces of data within iframes and things like that within your application, and adding the top level Google Analytics tracking or any other JavaScript based tracking like that, adding that at the top level where you're not changing URLs. If you're doing that in iframes or even direct AJAX JavaScript page writes, it becomes very, very difficult to get real ideas of what your users are doing. And so that's why you have to embed everything directly within your application.
Interesting. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, then at this point, I think let's go back and review the poll questions. And I will push this out. So this is not a big surprise. So it looks like a lot of AJAX is deployed on a lot of sites, but no monitoring actually on the client. About 10% actually have some sort of JavaScript monitoring, and 17% have page-level monitoring only. That's interesting. And we push the second one. Now this one's a little interesting. It's expected, but the degree is interesting. Obviously, this is kind of a technology adoption curve, and mobile is definitely newer than AJAX, so we'd expect it to be less likely to deploy. But there's a significant, number of, well, a very small number that actually have monitoring executing in the app on the client. So I think we'll see both of these shift over the next several months and years to be a lot more mobile apps deployed and more monitoring coming in. But I appreciate that information. I find that quite interesting. Any comments on that, Keith, you want to put out?
Absolutely. I do find it really interesting that the difference in people that are doing application monitoring, browser versus mobile. Browser, it makes sense that a lot of people are doing it, at least at some level, like page level monitoring. We saw only 10% of the audience attendees are actively monitoring at a function level within the browser applications. But it's very interesting to me that we don't have some of the mobile application folks monitoring at a functional level. Because I know it's a new technology, and a lot of firms are probably outsourcing their mobile application development. But a lot of the same tracking that you can do if you move that down one layer, and not necessarily in the presentation layer in the browser, but from your application server, you're at the HTTP level within your application, you can capture a lot of that as well. So it's interesting to me that that's not happening as much.
Well, you bring up a good point, which I think is probably a large part of that. A lot of these mobile apps are often either outsourced or done to a special group within a company, and there's such pressure to get them out and get revs out that it's a leaning on functionality versus monitoring. And in my experience, a few cases we have been involved with, it's like usually the app's out first, and then there's a problem, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, we need to add some monitoring in here on the next rev. So it is kind of a second or third pass in a priority scheme.
Yeah, and it's kind of as it should be, really. You want to get your users on the system, and so get the application out and available to get people on it before you start working on whatever intensive efforts that you have to do to get good insight and usability. That makes a lot of sense.
Okay, so I'm going to go to the wrap-up section here with our 4 tips. And the first one I've already given you. Apologize if it's too small, hopefully you can see it on your screen, but to really look at the client as its own tier and get monitoring on the client is the only way that you're going to get really good visibility. Every other approach, you're just going to get partial visibility. Not that there's not value from it, but to really get everything pulled together so that you understand what's happening, you're going to have some monitoring code running in the client, whether that's AJAX or mobile. Okay, so the second one we've touched on briefly, but I never really pulled it completely together, and that's lean, if you can, much more heavily towards real end-user data over synthetics. Oftentimes, the slowdowns are related to the dynamic nature of the app, the fact of the customization that's going on, or the individual action that a user took. So Keith talked a little bit about how a synthetic itself tends to give you artificially high or artificially better data because caching tends to pick it up. And so you have a higher cache hit ratio for synthetics than you do real users. So you want to get as close to what's really happening. The other challenge is you can't ever predict what your end users are going to do. They go different places. They find ways to get it done. If it's too slow here, they go to try to do it somewhere else. So the more you can just watch what they're doing in those changing behaviors, the better insights you're going to have into what's going on and where you need to spend your time to focus. So the third one is kind of a shift of perspective and thinking. So with AJAX, we're kind of moving away from a page load world into an interaction or an action world. So it used to be page load time was really the thing we cared about most from a performance point of view. That's no longer the case. Once the page loads, you might have several interactions that happen either synchronously or asynchronously, user interaction triggered or automatically, but those things become just as important. And if you take it to the extreme of a single page AJAX application, the page load is almost insignificant. If you're looking at an application like Google Maps, once the page is loaded, you might not load another page for 10 minutes, but you're doing lots of different actions. So you have to think about that in terms of what are you tracking to, what are you trying to measure. The page could load fast, but if I click on upgrade my CPU and it takes 10 or 15 seconds to load, that's important to me from a user experience point of view. And then the last one, which actually has a typo in the bottom, but the title is correct. For mobile apps, focus your time on the network requests that the app makes. What we found, at least in the current state of deployment, is that tends to be the higher risk point for slowing mobile apps down. So, the execution, of course you can have execution problems if it's a bad design, it's bad scrolling, or something like that, but those are usually caught during development and QA. The things that tend to slip out are like it runs great in QA, but then all of a sudden you're out in the field, you're running off of a slow connection or an old phone, and so the network requests are what's the highest risk point. So your monitoring needs to focus heavily on that first, knowing what requests the app's making and being able to aggregate that together so you can say, oh, everything's run fine, but except when you're anytime you drop below a 3G connection, this thing slows down dramatically because of the size of the data we're pushing back and forth, as an example. That may change over time as networks get better and better and LTE gets more widely deployed and the user base starts to shift to higher bandwidth connections, but at least for now that's what we're seeing as a very common pattern inside of mobile performance issues that we're seeing. So with that, I've wrapped up that particular piece. So I think we can open it up to questions at this point.
Great. We have a question here from Rainer. What are the tools and who does what in this monitoring?
What are there's a lot of tools. I could spend hours probably going through the tool set on those. I'm not sure quite how to answer that. But the types of tools tend to be, number one, either developer-based tools like the Chrome developer tools or other plugins you can put in a browser so that you can actually debug things and run performance analysis against it from a developer QA point of view. There's one class of tools that are like that. Then there's a class of tools that are more operationally focused. So this is designed to be actually used in the field with your users using it instead of an internal developer test environment. Those are the two main classes, and then inside of those there's AJAX instrumentation that a vendor will provide, and then you include it into your application with an include. And then there's the kind that's automatically injected, so if you have like bytecode instrumentation on a Java or .NET tier, you can have it introduce this instrumentation into the page of the app as it's delivered. That's another class. And then for like mobile, the most common paradigm is where a library would be provided that's compiled for either iOS or Android, and then you would link that library into your app and make like one or two calls to initialize it inside your app, and then it will kick up and do monitoring and report back to some central server what it's seeing, and then you typically look at that through some sort of portal content.
Excellent. Let's see here. How do you monitor user interaction monitoring at AJAX component level? Okay, so
this is to the point of moving from page to the action level. So AJAX is really just an acronym for asynchronous JavaScript and across XML, so that you click on a button and instead of loading a page, it'll execute some code. It may or may not talk back to a server. So the key is there's actions. It's like on a button click, we'll start something, and then at the end of it, typically the DOM is updated and some sort of piece of content is changed. You may add some content, you may have a pop-up, you may move to a new section, you may change something. But there's a start point, which is usually like a user clicking on something or hovering over something. And then there's an end point, which is all the calculation and the user update is completed. So what I'm talking about from an action point of view is you have to get in there and catch those events. So usually this means monitoring the DOM tree so you can register to say when did a click occur and when did this user presentation layer finish getting updated. And the time between those two is what I'm calling an action. And it gets tricky to do, but there are some tools to help pull that together. And that usually falls into this JavaScript monitoring type of thing, so that you can look at what DOM changes are happening and what are the events that are triggering them.
Yeah, the other way you can do that is again from the application server side, and watch the requests coming in, and just have some code in your application as well. So when a user performs an action, clicking or hovering or whatever it is, that issues an AJAX call into your application server, and you can log that request. And in fact, you can log pretty much everything you know about the user at that time, whatever their session ID is. If you know who their user is, you can actually log every bit of that. And then use some standard log analysis tools to basically pull that out and do your reporting on that on a month and on a periodic basis to compile reports. And then if there's any functional errors that throw up during that process, you can actually have the live analysis to be able to throw those alerts up to anybody in your DevOps team to know what's going on and be able to make any corrections if it's important.
Excellent. Peter wants to know, tools like CompuWare, APM, or Keynote are not much help with monitoring AJAX or single web page JavaScript applications. It doesn't sound like a question to me, but I guess.
Well, I think I know where he's going with that. So Keynote's a synthetic. It's a very popular one that runs synthetics. There's a number of them about it. Synthetics have kind of been commoditized over the years. In fact, CompuWare bought Gomez, and that's part of their solution. We have synthetics as well. I mean, it's a good thing to do. Synthetics are good because they baseline something, and it makes sure the site is up and running. So it's perfect to run overnight if you have a problem and nobody's using the site. But their value has really been diminishing over the years. That's why there's a shift towards real end-user data, because you get so much more. And you're right, you don't get a lot in terms of AJAX because it's hard to. You can script for it, and you can do with some of the more sophisticated tools. But the problem is you only have that one path. And as soon as the users start doing something else, you have no visibility into it. And the worst thing about synthetics is when your synthetics tell you everything's great, but then the users are calling in and saying it's not working. It doesn't do anything for you. And of the two, the real user is much more important. So you're right. Monitoring AJAX and mobile is a challenge right now. Everybody's kind of struggling to get their hands around that. Some of these tools, CompuWare has some tools that help. We have some tools that help. There's some other vendors that do things. But the state of the market is very much evolving, just because as you saw from the polls, the deployment of this technology is evolving, and it's kind of where the state of it's not state of practice yet. It's state of art, and we're moving that direction. So we're figuring out the best ways to do it, and there's different approaches. Different vendors have taken different approaches to do that. Some are more useful than others, but to get into the performance of AJAX is a challenge right now, and there's several different ways to do it, and you can kind of look at our site if you want more information about that. But the trick is finding out what it is that's most important to you and making sure that you monitor that would be my advice.
Great. Thank you so much. Our next question here is from David Jones. When you say client monitoring for mobile apps, are you saying having monitoring code embedded in the mobile app or a synthetic transaction to determine performance from all the hosted sites around the world or region to the server-side performance?
Okay. I am talking about monitoring code embedded into the app itself, not synthetics. So it would be some library that you link in that actually goes out with your app as users download it or you deploy it to them. So this code, when they execute, actually runs, and then it reports back what that person actually experienced. So as you get this, you start getting data points from many different users, your user base, and then so you automatically have synthetics, if you want to look at it that way, but it's your real users. And that's the trend in performance monitoring these days, is this shift away from synthetics. And then you'll see, and if it's in your real user population, if it's a cluster of problems around New York, maybe it's your New York region data center that's having a problem. You can see these geographic trends just as you would if you were running synthetics, but you don't have to go pre-record and run them from all those different locations.
Thank you so much. We have another question here. This one's from Peter. How do you define your KPIs without being able to compare? We only have onload available in most tooling.
Okay. Yeah, so your onload, you're basically talking about page load types. And that's where it gets back to a couple things. The instrumentation that you can look at the DOM gives you lower level granularity that you could define KPIs to. And then things like the resource timing API gives you a little bit lower granularity, but again, it's only supported in 2 major browsers right now. The key is usually you need to define these KPIs not in some generic sense, but specific to your application. So if you have a reservation app for a hotel systems and you're browsing through different properties, and whenever they actually say check availability, you want that to come back within 2 seconds or whatever your SLA is. That you can define specifically as when they click on the button for check availability, that will trigger some AJAX action. And you need to be able to trigger that and time that against when the DOM is updated with their content. Usually the biggest piece of that is going to be it's going to have to make a data request back to the server. And then when it gets the data, it does have to process it and then display it. So you need to see both of those components. And those are typically the KPIs that our customers find most interesting.
Yeah, and a lot of that's typically, it's very application-based. KPIs are definitely going to be different for each application. But so part of that is, knowing your app, knowing what your users want to do with it. But as far as defining them, you have to write code for that. You know what you define what your KPIs are, and then you work on being able to. You have code that sends information back to your monitoring system to be able to capture those metrics.
Thank you. Question here from Jed. What is the effect of in-client monitoring on performance overhead?
Okay, that's a good question. Obviously, with monitoring, you don't want to cause a problem by the monitoring itself by slowing things down. And for a long time, that was a big challenge, not only from the processing on the client, but also the bandwidth. You don't want to be pushing, because you need to send this data back somewhere or it's useless if you can't get it. So that means you're actually consuming some of that limited resource of bandwidth. Now, strangely enough, though, it has become less and less of a problem just as technology has advanced, because there's so much more processing time available. And power. I mean, my iPhone 5 is more powerful than the desktop machine I worked on right out of college. It's just the amount of processing we have has really gone up. In fact, most of the time it's sitting there idle. So even as you update or make a request, usually it's the network request. So you have a lot of spare cycles you can go through and actually process out of band. So you try to make sure the monitoring is always out of band from the user interaction, meaning it runs in the background and it takes lower priority. But you typically have a lot of cycles to do that. And even on the network side, and this is true for AJAX as well, you'd never want to send monitoring information as the page is loading. Let it finish loading. But then once it's done loading, you typically have some downtime both on the network and the CPU that you can leverage. So as long as you're smart about this, do some caching, cache some of the information, and when it's during a quiet period is when you send it. You can actually do this stuff with negligible impact. Most of the time you don't even ever notice it from an end user point of view. And that's one of the reasons you're seeing more and more of this technology kick in. the fact that you can do it without much of user overhead. As far as an actual percentage, I couldn't quote you because it varies a lot, but in the end, it's not noticeable by the user in most cases.
Thank you. A few more questions here. Song May would like to know, can you monitor the mouse movement without a click?
You actually can. So there's different events inside the DOM. One of them is a mouse click, obviously, but there's a separate event that's called mouse move. So you can actually track the mouse movements. Now, obviously, this generates a lot more data. So like in our instrumentation, it's a configurable item. We typically default with it off because you can just keep the overhead down lower, but if you want to get that level of granularity, you absolutely can. And then you'll have a string of events that, and again, it sounds like a lot of data, but everything is in relative terms. We think of a lot of data that looks big to our eyes, but if it fits into an 8K, packet stream, that's a lot of mouse movements. So it's still relatively light, but you can pick that up from JavaScript instrumentation from the DOM events.
Thank you. We have a question here from Peter. What is your opinion about the free Dynatrace AJAX edition and the PurePath technology?
Okay, I probably won't go too deep into evaluating competitive offers here. I mean, it's one of many tools which is doing this type of thing that we talked about, analyzing what's happening in the DOM and looking at where that pieces of information goes. There's subtle differences between different vendors and how they approach it. Some have advantages. In most cases, you'll find certain deployment scenarios, one vendor has advantages over another, and then you look at a different deployment scenario, and another vendor has advantages. So it's real important to kind of not look at one vendor as, oh, they're the best. It's usually you look at which vendor applies for what you're trying to do. I highly recommend.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions here. Folks, now's the time. If you do have questions for our speakers, please send them in. Open the group chat, type it in, send it in while the experts are still with us. Okay, question from Song May. Does Google Analytics and the SDK for mobile monitor user action on AJAX?
Well, let's see. For the SDK for mobile is actually for mobile apps. So you're not really talking AJAX at that point. You can use Google Analytics to do some AJAX monitoring, but the majority of the impetus is really on you. You have to kind of like code into inside the actions to trigger certain Google tags to come together. So there is some support in there, but the SDK for mobile is actually falls into that category I mentioned before, which is you link it into the mobile app, and then as the app is being used, it actually what it really does is it pretends like it's a browser, and it sends off a request to the Google API to say this person just hit this point of your application. So it looks like a page load to Google, and then you can see that data through Google Analytics.
Alrighty, and that is the final question I see that has come in. So folks, we are going to push out a URL to you here. It's going to open in another tab or window on your computer. It's a really cool infographic that Dell has just come out with for the AJAX app. So I hope you can see that. It is outstanding. And folks, with that, we're going to say a very big thank you to Dell for sponsoring today's webcast. A very big thank you to our speakers today. They did an outstanding job. To Steve and Keith Hudgins, of course. Thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge and expertise with us. To all of our attendees today, we thank you so much for attending our webcast and hope you benefited from it. Folks, again, to remind you, we are recording the webcast, and we will have the archive available within 48 hours, and you will receive an email notification. This will conclude today's event. Goodbye, everybody.